It's about to get very real for Darko Rajakovic this season. How good should the offense be? Is the defense for real? It's all Darko on today's Locked On Raptors.
You are Locked On Raptors, your daily Toronto Raptors podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
It's your favorite part of the day. Thanks for making Locked On Raptors your first listen every day. I'm Vivek Jacob. I've been covering the Toronto Raptors for 8 seasons across several outlets. You can follow Locked On Raptors on X, Instagram, and YouTube. And be sure to check out the Locked On Raptors Discord, where you can talk all things basketball, but especially the Raptors. It is Thursday, September the 18th, and I am joined by former and possibly future NBA writer and podcaster extraordinaire, Joe Wolfond. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, man. Wonderful to be here. Just enjoying these last vestiges of summer. Yeah, doing great.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of in that middle phase where like we've gotten through most of the offseason except for whatever's going on with the Warriors and the Kuminga situation, and now we're gearing up for training camp and preseason and whatnot, and we'll get into the flow of things as the regular season comes along. And as we tee things up, this looks like it will be a very important season for Darko Rajakovic. I think we can all agree the first 2 seasons, very low expectations from a winning standpoint. The first season, when you look back, he was just dealt a tough hand with a team in flux. There's the team he started with, then there's the team after the OG trade, the team after the Pascal trade, then Scotty's injury after All-Star. So just a lot going on. And last season, I think, was actually, all things considered, a good season for Darko. You wanted to see growth and development from the young players. I think we saw some important strides for Ochai Agbaji. I think we saw Grady Dick get some really important high-level usage to expand his game, to kind of see where he needs to improve and what he kind of has in his bag. Scotty obviously made big strides defensively. So I think all in all, from a growth and development perspective, it was a good season for Darko. And now, coming up to this season, it is very much going to be about getting wins on the board. And to me, the starting point of that is probably the defense. When you look at the strides this team made defensively, they finished 14th overall. After the All-Star break, they were 3rd behind the Warriors and Magic. And I know maybe the asterisk that comes along with that is that 18 of those games were against teams that were bottom 10 in net rating. Only 3 of those games came against teams in the top 10 in net rating. How do you feel about Darko's defense at this point?
I don't know. I think that's there's going to be a lot of shrugging of shoulders when we talk about Darko as a coach. I think we've learned some things about him in the last couple of years. And one of the things I'm most excited about this season is the idea that we're going to get to learn a lot more about him, because the expectations are actually there, and because presumably this is just going to be like a normal Raptors season and not one where, as you alluded to, he wound up coaching like 4 or 5 different versions of the team in his first year. And then last year was like, an organizational mandate essentially to lose games. So I think, there are a couple things you can point to where like there's, the extended ball pressure and high pickup points. It's obviously been foundational to his defensive philosophy here. And that is something that we've seen be really successful around the league, obviously with the Pacers, the Thunder. Throughout the playoffs, I think you're seeing teams like pick up in the backcourt and make ball pressure really foundational in their approach. And I think the question I have about that is, does that work with this group? Because, it's one thing when you have Davion Mitchell there sort of pestering ball handlers, picking them up 90 feet. And it's another thing when it's, Emmanuel Quickley who's going to be asked to do that, and, Ochai Agbaji and Grady Dick and RJ Barrett. I think, Jamal Shed is maybe the guy who would be best equipped to do that on the roster. But I don't know, man. I just don't know. There's always this question that I have when it comes to coaching in the NBA of like, what's the balance between bringing your own ideas and your own principles to the table and trying to graft them onto your roster, and then also kind of like looking at the personnel group you have and coaching to that group, right? Like, I don't think it has to be all one or all the other, but I do think there has to be a balance there. So I think for him, this season is going to be about figuring that balance out, right? Like figuring out where can his ideas and his beliefs about the best way to play defense meet the team that he actually has, and the best way to get the most out of that group. So in terms of like what we saw in the back half of last season and the success they had, I don't want to totally throw it out the window, but I'm almost throwing it entirely out the window just because of A, the schedule they had, B, the fact that they themselves were playing a whole bunch of guys who are not going to be getting serious minutes for this year's team. And I think we're kind of starting with a clean slate here.
Yeah, no, I think those are all fair points. I think, when you bring up the backcourt defense, I think that does sort of, kind of magnify the importance of the front court and how much they are going to have to kind of keep this team's defense's head above water. And when you look at what Jakob Poeltl and Scotty Barnes have done together at their best, I think that's probably the most encouraging aspect of the defense. And then there is, again, a question mark of how Brandon Ingram will fit into all of this and what he will bring defensively. I think a lot of people want to talk about the offense and what he'll add in that area. And obviously you expect, someone with his offensive repertoire to be able to lift this team offensively, but defensively, I think it's going to be an interesting thing where Scotty is probably at his best in the back line, and we've seen his rim protection skills there, his ability to help. But if you look at Brandon Ingram, he's not so much someone you want to have on the perimeter. And I think in general, when he's had his best defensive moments, it's when he's been able to use his length in and around the basket, and then, maybe stretch out to the perimeter. So I think that's a choice that Darko is going to have to make, where he says, okay, do I challenge Scotty to be on the perimeter more, and have him, do the best that he can in that area, which might help the team be at its best defensively? Or do I just lean on what I've seen from Scotty and Yak, and then get Brandon Ingram to just figure it out?
Yeah, I mean, another thing I'm really curious to see, because it's something like I've asked Darko about over the past couple seasons, and the way that he's talked about it is interesting to me as we look forward to a season where the expectations are going to be changing in a meaningful way. He hasn't done a ton of like really funky stuff defensively, right? Like if you look around the league, there's all these teams that are running kind of like complex zones with their own different kinds of rules, right? And doing a lot of cross matching and just different ways to shapeshift and be unpredictable, and also to maybe like hide certain weaker defenders. And there hasn't been a ton of that from Darko. And again, I understand that the personnel has been shifting like a Rubik's Cube, right? Like it's hard to get a handle on how you want to play when from one game to the next, there's not a lot of predictability on who's even going to be in the lineup. But what he has said when I've asked him about it is sort of like he's more focused on like drilling these principles, building out his base defense, and not wanting to confuse things by trying a bunch of different stuff. And to his credit, like getting that team to 14th in defensive efficiency last year is a real achievement. But I think this year, where you have more stability in terms of who's going to be on the team, you have a mandate to actually try and push for the playoffs to win more games. This is when I'm curious to see how much of that experimentation is actually going to go on. And I think, thinking about Quickly, for example, right? Like, is there a way to hide him in a zone scheme where maybe he's not up at the top of the defense having to play at the point of attack? Maybe you're hiding him in the corner, right? He's actually a pretty good, like, attuned help defender, somebody who can get in the gaps, be disruptive. Can you use him in that way, right? As opposed to having him, like, chase ball handlers around screens and getting blown up at the point of attack. And And in terms of what you're talking about the ways to use Scotty, right? Like that's something I think about too, where yes, I do think he's at his best on the back line, but also he doesn't have to be there all the time. And if you're using him on the perimeter, can use him at the top of a zone where he can weaponize his length and his anticipation, things like that. I think there are opportunities and avenues where you can find different creative ways to get the most out of a defensive personnel group that, honestly, if I'm looking at it, it's like, I don't think the upside is like super duper high. I think it's like on paper looking to me like basically an average defense. Mm-hmm. So if you're pushing above that, if you're pushing into the top 10, to me, that means you're pushing certain buttons that are making the whole, I guess, greater than the sum of the parts. Because while there are very good defenders among this group, Scotty Chief among them, CMB coming in, like Yak on the back line, I think there are also real question marks defensively from Quickly to Grady to RJ, Ingram. And I'm curious to see where all that's going to land. But I think there needs to be... I don't think it can be as sort of like straightforward, as dogmatic. I think there needs to be a little bit more flexibility in terms of principles, in terms of scheme and things like that to help them get to that point.
Yeah, no, I think I'm with you from a personnel standpoint. And again, those issues that you've raised with the backcourt. The one thing coming back to your question from earlier, and it's like looking at what OKC does, looking at what the Pacers do in terms of that relentlessness. I do think one positive for the Raptors is that when you look to the bench and you see guys like Jacoby Walter and Ochai and Colin Murray-Boyles, I think there is enough personnel there to at least maintain that style of play for the majority of the 48 minutes. And what that nets out as is what we have to wait and see. But I think at least there's enough there in terms of personnel to play that style for an extended period.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I mean. Like, it might be a situation where when the bench guys come in, you play a different style, right? Like,
yeah.
And that's obviously this. I don't think we're going to see a lot of like full bench lineups this season. I think they're very well set up actually to play these kind of mixed groups where there's a stagger pattern. A couple of the starters are going off early and then coming back in with the bench. I think they're actually like well constructed to do exactly that. But if you've got like three of those bench guys on the floor at one time, like, yeah, that might allow you to play a more aggressive blitzing style of defense. And that's the kind of thing where, yeah, you need to see a little bit more of the variability and flexibility. And yeah, I mean, I think, Darko is perfectly capable of like understanding that and implementing that. So it's not like I'm saying it's not going to happen. That's kind of one of the things that I'm going to be watching for this year defensively.
Yeah. Coming up next, we will get into what we are looking for offensively out of Darko and the Raptors. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. Monarch is built for people with busy lives. If you've put off organizing your finances, Monarch is for you. Monarch does the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. Monarch helps me identify when I'm not investing as much as I should or if I've got money allocated inefficiently. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNBA. And we are back ready to talk about Darko's offense, what we've seen so far. I think we can all agree that there's a lot of passing that goes on with this team and not necessarily in the most constructive and productive way. And we've seen with this team, last year finishing 25th overall in offense, 20, and even when you look at the schedule against the weak opponents, that stretch when they were third in defense, they were still 26th in offense. And, this is a team that takes a lot of shots at the rim, but does not get up a lot of threes, is not efficient shooting the ball. Do you think this is a team that, has a good system in place and has just needed better personnel to knock down the shots? Or do you feel that there are holes in this offense that aesthetically looks a lot better than it really is?
Does it look good aesthetically? I mean, that's another question I would have. No, look, I think the limitations have been primarily personnel based. There's no doubt about that. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with the way that Darko wants his offense to operate. But I do think, if we want to look at Ingram as sort of the hinge point in all of this, I think that's a really interesting question, because there's obviously been a lot of talk about how Ingram is going to have to adapt in order to fit into this offense, right? And I think that's valid. Like, you want Ingram to be doing more when the ball isn't in his hands. You want him to be cutting more and leveraging his size as a finisher. You want him to be getting up those catch and shoot threes when they're available to him. You want to see him kind of grow in all of those areas. Those are going to be super important. But there has to be some adaptation from Darko as well. And, I think back to like the first half of the season 2 years ago with Pascal. And it's not entirely fair, because I genuinely believe that he came into that season thinking Pascal wasn't going to be on the team. Like, they had shopped him that whole summer. I don't think mentioned him really at all on media day. Like, it was very clear that he was coming in, or in his mind was coming in to coach a team without Siakam on it, and then kind of had to try to adapt on the fly. And I remember writing about them early in the season, like a few games in, where there were all of these indicators that seemed to be really positive, like things that you would associate with good functional offense. Like, they were way, way up in terms of the passes per game, assist rate, the amount that they were cutting, the off-ball actions. They had gone from like being one of the highest volume pull-up shooting teams in the league to like all of their threes then were coming off of the catch. Like, these are things that essentially you want, like they're markers of like a healthy offensive ecosystem, and they were like by far the worst half-court offense in the league, despite all of that stuff. And I think as things progressed before Siakam got traded, like Darko adjusted and started leaning more into like getting Pascal back into the post, like using some more of like those mid-post ISOs and just like playing bully ball with the big wing creators that he had at his disposal. And it wasn't enough to save that doomed season, but like the offense did improve at that point.
I mean, that mini stretch when like after the OG trade and before the Pascal trade was probably in Darko's era the best basketball that we've seen the Raptors play.
Yeah. And like I at the time was, whatever. We don't have to relitigate all of that stuff, but I wasn't one of the people who was trying to rush Pascal out the door. I thought it would have been worthwhile to try to keep him around, but point being, I think to a certain extent, yes, you want Ingram to adapt, but you also have to let Ingram be Ingram to a certain extent. And yeah, you want to let him feel the ball a lot. You want to have him running a lot of pick and roll and snaking his way to the middle of the floor for those mid-range pull-ups. Like, you want him doing the things that he is comfortable doing and is going to do well. And he's going to, in turn, provide things that you have lacked from this offense in terms of on-ball creation, pull-up creation, like all of this stuff that you just haven't really had for the last couple of years. So similar to what I was saying with the defense, right? There needs to be a little bit of a marriage of your offensive ideals and playing to the personnel that you have. And I just think as much as maybe he might be willing to and even capable of tweaking his game, I just don't think Ingram is ever going to be this guy who is like zipping around off the ball, cutting really hard, having like a super quick trigger off of the catch. I think those things can improve and should improve, but I still think ultimately if you're going to like play to his strengths and get the most out of him, you're going to have to let him be himself to an extent. So I think there should be, hopefully will be a point where they can meet in the middle. And yeah, again, maybe the Pascal comparison isn't entirely fair, but that is the thing that I sort of think back to when you're trying to shoehorn this roster into a style of play that it isn't necessarily built to execute. That's what I hope that we don't see.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest concern going into next season is, how long will it take the starting five to kind of get accustomed to playing with each other, and what, say it takes 15, 20 games and, we see some of that clunkiness between Ingram and Scotty that we saw with Pascal and Scotty, then, I'm sure that there'll be concerns on that. And so it'll be interesting to see what Darko has kind of taken from that previous experience and what he's able to implement now. And obviously, with a couple of years experience, you do expect things to improve on that end. And I do think that, from a health perspective, if this team, if Ingram plays 60 plus games, if Quickly plays 60 plus games, and, the young guys off the bench, in terms of Jacoby and Grady and Ochai provide what they can, like, I think there's an adequate level of 3-point shooting. Not to say that it's, anything near where you want it to be, but I think there's an adequate enough level to where we start to see Darko's system function and execute in a much more meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, Quickly is like sort of the key to that in a way, because like, especially with the starting lineup, it's like you got one movement shooter, like, and one guy with real off-ball gravity. And so I'm not saying you want to like totally shunt aside all of the on-ball reps for him, because I think, he's also like a solid ball handler, like somebody you feel comfortable with initiating, and like you want to also continue to try to develop his pick and roll playmaking. So I'm not
saying
of
this shooting rhythm will stem from just having the ball in his hands and just being able to run the offense.
Right, and he was one of the best, at least by percentage, one of the best pull-up 3-point shooters in the league last season. So like you want to continue to make that part of your package, but I think, if you're thinking about where do you want the initiation reps to come from, I would want more of those pick and roll reps to be going to Ingram, frankly. Not only because I think he's quite a bit better as a passer than Quickly is, but also because Quickly has so much more off-ball gravity. And I think if you utilize him more as an off-guard, who's flying off of pin downs and handoffs, like rip DHOs and flex DHOs and things that can really like bend a defense out of shape, make things easier for the other four guys on the floor. Like if Quickly is the one who has the ball in his hands, if you're thinking about the starting lineup, at least, like you got four other guys on the floor who aren't doing that, who aren't really magnetizing defenders, like don't really have off-ball gravity. Like there's maybe some cutting gravity there with like RJ and Scotty, but that's going to be tough sledding. So I think that's another factor, right? Like how are they deploying Quickly, and can they do enough with him that the offense has a little bit of space to breathe despite the lack of shooting elsewhere?
Yeah. With that, coming up next, we are going to talk about the thing that will likely be most important for Darko next season. What can we expect in terms of wins for the Raptors? If you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. Think about the last time you had an urgent need, maybe for a plumber or a service provider. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait? Probably not. You moved on. That's why you need OpenPhone. OpenPhone is the #1 business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. OpenPhone lets me manage business calls and texts from a single app. OpenPhone is offering our listeners 20% off your first 6 months at openphone.com/LockedOnNBA. That's OpenPhone.com/LockedOnNBA. And if you have existing numbers with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone. No missed calls, no missed customers. Back here, ready to wrap it up. And as we said, the last couple of seasons, Darko's first 2 seasons with the team, you're probably focused on the growth and development of the young players on the team more than anything. This is the first season that he will have real expectations when it comes to the win column. Vegas has this team at 37.5 wins for the over-under. I imagine internally the Raptors are expecting a bit more than that. I think they would want to see this team at least be a 500 team for all that money that's in the starting 5. Is there a win total where you would consider Darko's job to not be safe?
Again, context is everything, right? Like, is the roster healthy?
Yeah. Say the roster is healthy, all things being equal. Is it like, say, sub 35 wins?
So, yeah, I think sub 35, that's a huge disappointment. That's like you're probably not even in the play-in, even in the Eastern Conference. If you're under 35 wins, you're not in the top 10 seed. And again, if the roster's healthy and that's where you end up, I think his seed is getting warm, and like that's mega disappointing. Yeah, for sure. Even like, I don't know, like again, like taking for granted that you have at least a baseline of like health and availability from your top players, like under 40, I think is kind of disappointing. Like I think the expectation should be that you're going to be a 500 team and that you're at the very least going to be in the play-in mix. Like not in the play-in mix, in the play-in.
Yeah.
And I think anything less than that would be, underachievement. And I get that in spite of the talent on the roster, the clunkier fit between some of these pieces might make the whole amount to less than the sum of its parts. And I'm, again, willing to see, like I say this a lot, I don't think you just look at a result and say, well, that was a failure and, the coach has to go because he couldn't get the best out of this group. I think there are a lot of things that have to go into that in terms of style of play, like growth from young players, like whatever kind of synergy that you might see or ideas that might be interesting at either end of the floor. Like all of that has to be taken into account. But I think, if you're in the 30s and wins, I think that's pretty disappointing. So,
right. Let me ask you this: if the Raptors, say for example, the offense still looks clunky, and say the Raptors are a 500 team, but they're still bottom 10 in offense. How would you feel about that team?
I'd feel fine. Like, I don't think it matters necessarily how you get there. And again, like what is the limiting factor there? Like, are they bottom 10 in offense because they shot 32% from 3 as a team? I don't know if you would necessarily put that failing on Darko. I think there could be a situation where the team was terrible at shooting threes, terrible at shooting mid-rangers, and yet they still managed to be like 21st in offensive efficiency, and that actually feels like a win because they found all these marginal gains elsewhere by playing in transition, crashing the offensive glass, like, things like that, getting to the free throw line, whatever it happens to be, where even finishing 21st in offense can feel like overachievement, for a team that just really struggled to shoot the ball. I think, again, that's why context is important. So if they're a 500 team, but they're bottom 10 in offense, but like they're top 10 in defense, and like they're, again, when it comes to like play style, are they doing things that make sense? Is he trying to like shoehorn an incongruous philosophy onto this team, or is he actually playing in a way that's like making the most of the pieces that he has, that's a situation where I could see getting to the end of the season and still being really happy with the job that he did. But that could go the other way too, right? Like they could be 500 and you could feel like there was a lot of meat left on the bone, right? And still feel disappointed with that.
Yeah. So we've considered the downside. On the upside, I think on the high end, this team has enough potential, if everything goes right, to be the 5th seed in the East. I think the top 4 in some order is going to be Knicks, Cavs, Magic, Hawks. And then I think it comes down to what does Milwaukee look like, with Giannis and everyone around him just shooting the ball. What, does Detroit take a step forward, or do they stagnate a bit? I think that's going to be an important part of this. I think a lot of people are taking for granted that they're just going to, continue to improve. I'm a bit skeptical of that. And then, we'll see where the Miamis of the world end up. We'll see, where Boston's at with their goals for the season. So I think from that standpoint, the high end would be around the 5th seed. Or let's just put it, as sort of a guaranteed playoff spot, 5th or 6th. And I think that's something that you would look at Darko, say if the team is finishing somewhere with 44 plus wins, I think you would consider that a success. How would you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was going to say for the high end, I could see this team getting up to like 47 wins. And in this conference, that should be good for a top 5 seed. It's just crazy how wide open it feels, right? Like even you saying that top 4 that you're willing to write in pen, like I think Atlanta and Orlando both are super interesting. But I could totally see things going wrong there where, neither of those teams are in the top 4. Like I don't think that is in any way set in stone. Now, I'm not saying like I'm expecting the Raptors to be the team that would usurp them and take one of those top 4 spots. I'm just saying it feels really, really wide open to the point where the range of outcomes for all these different teams, whether you're talking about the Raptors, Celtics, Pacers, Heat, Bucks, like all of these teams, it just feels like they could end up in that top 4 or like down at the very bottom of the play-in or out of the play-in entirely. It just feels like all of that is on the table for all these different teams. And I think that's going to make it, especially just like the first few weeks of the season, seeing where things start to shake out. Because I do think even in the early part of the year, we can kind of start to see like how the wheat gets separated from the chaff, and like certain teams are going to move in one direction, maybe like unintentionally or intentionally. Like the Celtics are one team that I might have my eye on in that regard. Like which direction are they going to go? Miami. And like, if the Bucks just get off to a miserable start, like what does that mean? Like how antsy is Giannis going to get? Like it just feels like everything in this conference is up in the air. So where do the Raptors slot into that? Like like I said before, they should be a top 8 team at the very least, right? Like they should be in the play-in and playing their way into the playoffs proper through the play-in, if not getting a top 6 seed outright. I think that's a fair expectation. 500 or above, anywhere between, like 41 and like 45, 46, 47 wins, I think should be on the table.
Yeah, I think we land pretty much in the same place. I think at worst, hosting at least one play-in game, and then finishing with at least a plus 500 record. I think that's a good place to leave it. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on Darko that you wanted to get out before we wrap up here.
Just one, because like in talking about the Ingram thing, it like reminded me of a quote that he gave me for a story at the end of his first season, where we were talking about this kind of idea of like what he sees around the league in the playoffs and what that means to him, what he wants to take with him. And so I pulled it up, and what he said is, when I watch the NBA playoffs, I know what I see every single year. All of those teams in the first round, they run, 20 to 30 plays. Then that gets cut down to 15, cut down to 10. Then you watch the NBA Finals, and they're not running plays. They're just running very simple actions because their players are so good in those situations that it's hard to guard anyway. And my goal is to develop our guys, not just over the summer, but for the full next season and in the future, to become really hard to handle in one-on-one situations. So I think about that and the idea of like carrying that onto a roster where, maybe there actually isn't all like that much connectivity or synergy with like all these sort of mismatched parts, but can you find optimal positions to like put Ingram in one-on-one situations where he can be successful, put Scotty in those situations as well? And, I think there are a lot of different ways to build a successful offense, and maybe the Raptors can be successful by doing things that they haven't been doing in the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to leave it. Joe, thanks so much for joining me. I know you've got unemployed guy in the title, but I think we all recognize you as amazing writer and podcaster guy. So hope you're back on the circuit soon enough. Everyone, make sure you're following Joe on Twitter. It's Joey_W. And right now, it's all Blue Jays tweets.
Mostly Blue Jays tweets.
I'm sure he'll get back into some NBA content soon enough. If you want to carry on our discussion, head on over to the Locked On Raptors Discord. The link is in the description. And remember, the Locked On NBA Top 100 is here, voted on by the NBA hosts of the Locked On Podcast Network. Our Top 100 was formed by experts that cover these teams and players every day. Find the full list on Locked On Sports today on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.